Thank you all for joining us in this roundtable discussion on the internal governance of transnational deliberation processes. To start us off, let me introduce myself. I'm Nardina Nimmer, project co-lead of the Global Citizens Assembly Network with Professor Nicole Curato. And the network is a research collective that generates actionable insights to inform policymakers, funders, process designers, advocates, and even the wider community of practice that is involved in the design, implementation, and evaluation of global citizens' assemblies. We're particularly keen to collaborate with any organization that's interested in the funding, design, and implementation aspects of global citizens' assemblies. And for this first iteration of the project, we have focused on governance. This technical group who's hosting this roundtable today, Mel Ross, Hazel Jovita, and Lucas Veloso, have been conducting a systemic governance review of the Global Assembly on the climate and ecological crisis, one of the world's first examples of a citizens' assembly at that scale and scope. I now turn to Hazel, who will present the findings of the technical group on the specific challenges, creative responses, and pathways towards more equitable and sustainable ways of organizing global deliberation.
Okay. Thanks, Nardine. And yeah, I am supposed to. All right. So yeah, hello, everyone. Together with my colleagues, Mel and Lucas, I will be sharing our findings on the effective and accountable governance of global citizens' assemblies. So our technical paper offers recommendations on the internal governance of transnational citizen assemblies, and we draw lessons from the world's first global assembly on the climate and ecological crisis, as documented in reports and secondary data, as well as from the data we gathered through focus group discussions and questionnaires. Okay, so it's not moving. Okay. So, yeah, in this paper, we use the term stakeholders to refer to groups and individuals involved in the commissioning and delivery of transnational deliberative process. Meanwhile, internal governance refers to structures and mechanisms through which stakeholders establish roles and responsibilities, how they set goals, allocate resources, design, and implement the assembly. So one of the processes that worked best during the Global Assembly is the inclusion of the diverse groups of individuals from 112 countries with 39 languages in at least 10 time zones. However, there were issues related to the lack of expert opinion, non-inclusion of assembly members with radical climate position, among others. And with this, we believe that actors who commission and deliver the process should include representatives from all stakeholder groups in design and implementation of the assembly. And with this, one recommendation is that stakeholder representatives should reflect diversity in terms of expertise, gender, region, and ethnicity. Also, during the Global Assembly, some assembly members were affected by power cuts, rains and storms, and violent conflict. The respective community hosts improvised solutions, but these were limited to individual situations. And we believe that for future iterations, actors who design and deliver the process should allow for flexibility and design and adaptability in implementation. And specifically, we recommend that regional and local stakeholders should take up monitoring functions to keep tabs on environmental, political, and social events that might affect delivery in their countries or regions. And running a transnational citizens' assembly demands constant communication among stakeholders, possibly across time zones and locations and in multiple languages. And with this, we recommend that open access to information and clear channels for communication with all stakeholders should be established. Specifically, stakeholders must develop clear rules about when and how to communicate and ensure equal access to information. Now, accountability in the context of internal governance of a transnational deliberative process can face a lot of challenges, such as informality and lack of transparency in decision-making, which may weaken trust in the process. In the Global Assembly, most design and delivery decisions were made by the Central Circle, with inputs and recommendations from different advisory bodies and individuals. Other stakeholders often did not feel empowered to make decisions over changes in implementation or adjustments that deviated from the design. And with this, we recommend that all stakeholders must collectively establish their roles, responsibilities, and agree over rules for decision-making and lines of accountability. And in any process, conflicts and ethical challenges can arise in the delivery of transnational assemblies. Our respondents reported that problems during the implementation of the Global Assembly were usually escalated to the Central Circle, including failure to deliver and non-compliance with the terms of service. Most respondents did not feel entitled to tackle those problems directly. And with this, we recommend that actors who commission and deliver the process should appoint a person or groups to oversee the integrity of the process and review conflicts. They should have autonomy to investigate, trigger sanctions with independence from commissioners and deliverers. Also, they may offer nonviolent communication or other conflict management trainings. And a transnational citizen assembly brings together individuals to work together for a short period of time, but they do collaborate and exchange intensively with each other. And with this, we believe that actors who commission and deliver the process should go develop a plan and options about how to continue collaborations with all stakeholders and assembly members after the process is concluded, because abruptly interrupting those relations can damage trust in the process and among stakeholders. And those are the major points of our technical paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hazel. And it's very fitting now to move on to insights from Jayne Carrick, who has also done a review of the governance structures of different climate assemblies for the Knowledge Network on climate assemblies. Jayne?
Thank you. Thanks, Nadine. So as Nadine's just said, I'm here to talk about a paper that I wrote for the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, who I'll refer to as their lovely acronym of KNOCA from now on. I'm just going to put a link to the paper in the chat so you can have a look at that, as I didn't prepare slides for today. The paper that I've just shared with you was issued and was prepared about 18 months ago now, and it was a comparison of the first 8 national climate assemblies and the governance of those. Those were the Irish, French, UK, Danish, Scottish, Jersey, Finnish and German climate assemblies. I have to write those all down because I always forget some. And what I did to facilitate the comparison of those climate assemblies was undertake interviews with people involved in the governance of those processes. What we found was that there was 3 main types of governance structures that were that became apparent during our analysis. The first is where a commissioner appoints a secretariat, and this was undertaken by the Scottish and the Irish Climate Assembly. So the secretariat would comprise of civil servants, seconded civil servants, the commissioner in both these cases, the governments of Ireland and Scotland put into place. In France, the governance was held by a multi-stakeholder group. So the President Macron, and his civil servants, they implemented or organised a multi-stakeholder group comprising of people as diverse as people from the ministries, but also people from the Yellow Vest movement. And by far the kind of most popular, if you like, governance structure was where the commissioners actually appointed a third party or an external delivery organisation. Those were that sort of arrangement was undertaken by the other climate assemblies that I analysed, but the ways in which the commissioners related to the external contractors or the external delivery organisations did vary. So I identified a case where the commissioners held an active control in the governance of the Climate Assembly, and that was the Climate Assembly UK, where the commissioners were particularly active and held under more tight control. Then the next sort of category, if you like, was commissioners that had a supervisory control. So these were commissioners where in the Danish and the German case, where the commissioners would attend regular meetings with the delivery organisations to advise them on very specific decisions. And then there was more what I would call consultative commissioners, where they more sort of stepped back from the governance. In the Finnish and the Jersey case, the commissioners actually commissioned the external delivery organisations and then took a step back and only really got involved with ad hoc advice. And obviously that has implications for the how independent all these different structures have implications for the independence of the process, how independent it's seen, but also in terms of the buy-in that the commissioners seem to have with the different processes. One of the innovations that I did find quite interesting, just while I finish up, was the involvement of assembly members themselves in the governance of Pacific processes. So I think the French and the Danish climate assemblies had involved members of the assemblies within their governance meetings during the actual process itself. And that did, in the words of one of my interviewees, sort of break some stalemates where there was stalemates in the decision making. So that was quite an interesting innovation. But I think the other sort of key thing that I took from it was that none of the governance structures were particularly well formalized. So they were all kind of dependent on goodwill and compromise, and that was maybe something that could perhaps be amended sort of going forward. So I'll finish there.
That's great. Thank you, Jayne. I guess that's actually really interesting and a very good segue to the point to introduce Claire's work here, who is one of the co-founders of the Global Assembly, which Mel, Hazel and Lucas have reviewed. Claire, just as we heard from Jayne, there is a lot to learn from the national climate assemblies, but there's very little in terms of the global level, particularly because it's not really connected to one particular government as such. What are some of the learnings from the Global Assembly based on your experience?
Yes, thank you very much. So I just want to start by saying that the work done by GloCAN, by the team on the internal governance of Global Citizens Assembly, I think is relevant beyond Global Citizens Assemblies. And the findings are indeed pertinent to other transnational deliberative processes. And for instance, I'm thinking of global deliberation run by private companies such as Meta, or deliberative polling by Stanford University. So I think it goes beyond just learning for global citizens' assemblies. And the internal governance of deliberative processes, so citizens' assemblies being one mechanism, is, in my opinion, under-researched. And it's really of interest to all of us in deliberative democracy. And in my experience, internal governance, that I sometimes call the black box, is a complex system whose internal workings are often hidden, opaque, or not really readily understood. And what this GloCAN research paper is doing is very much needed. It's surfacing some of the internal mechanism for effective and accountable governance, as Hazel has explained. So it's providing to me and everyone else who was involved in the design and the delivery of the Global Assembly an opportunity to practice critical reflective learning. And with that in mind, I just want to acknowledge that these are my personal reflections and learning, and I don't claim to represent the views of other people or organizations. So that's the footnote disclaimer out of the way. So in just a few minutes, what I'd like to do is share two key reflections, and maybe three if I have time, but two critical ones for me, which are looking at what we call holacracy and decentralization and decision-making processes for the Global Assembly. And the other one is related to trends in artificial intelligence development and the impact this could have on future Global Assemblies. So the first point around holacracy, and that's in the technical paper. I don't think Hazel mentioned it in depth in presentation, but the Global Assembly was a bottom-up initiative, and in the absence of an external commissioning entity, an external commissioning body, it meant there was more freedom to design our own internal governance. But these brought its own challenges and its own opportunities. In theory, the internal governance was informed by the principles of holacracy and distributed leadership, which are meant to allow stakeholders to be more autonomous and function around a collection of roles and responsibilities. So holacracy is basically a system of self-management where leadership roles are not subject to a traditional kind of hierarchy of command. In practice, due to the lack of time and resources to design and deliver the Global Assembly, and just as a reminder, we had about 6 months from the moment the funding was fully secured in around May 2021 and the end of the process in December 2021. So that was a very short and constrained period of time, and because of also of the lack of experience, I would say, in holacracy by most of the Global Assembly organizers, in my opinion, the Global Assembly was closer to what I would call an agile model than an holacratic model of decision making. So there was a real intention to decentralize decision making. That's what agile systems are all about. And I think we learn lots from that, and the findings from your research are showing that to some extent it worked. And as you said, Hazel, there were more than 112 organizations, 400 people involved in the delivery. So it was not a minor achievement to some extent to get people to feel empowered to deliver. But I would say, just to conclude on that, I think it provided challenges and opportunities. So the challenges for me were around hierarchy patterns. So in the research paper, there are often times when it shows that people felt there was a hierarchy and that they couldn't actually make some of the decisions and they needed to go back to what the so-called central circle. So this shows that actually in practice, I don't think we really nailed, holacratic processes. And it's a very different model from the more traditional internal governance mechanism that Jayne has been talking about earlier, and where when you've got a commissioning body, these are more, in a way, more hierarchical models and top-down. So I think there's a lot here to learn from, and I think the opportunities are huge, and there's a real license to, in our case, to experiment and learn from this and be agile, but a lot more research is needed, I think, on this, and I know some people are, so that's exciting. The second point I wanted to talk about was around AI development, artificial intelligence development. So when the Global Assembly was initiated and convened back in 2020, 2021, developments in AI and their potential application for deliberative processes were very much in their infancy, really. And I remember Hélène Landemore mentioning the risks and opportunities of AI for deliberative practice back in 2020, when we were observing the French Citizens Climate Convention. And at that point, I was wondering what this was all about. And 4 years later, I really understand why she was interested in the ethics of AI, because the research and the practice of AI for deliberation has moved at a pace that is quite hard to keep up with, especially in the last 6 months, I would say. And in several places in the paper that Melisa, Hazel, and Lucas have written, they are referring to opportunities for using AI in future global citizens' assemblies, such as, using it for automated transcription and translation services, for instance, or for process documentation and transcription and translation. So, for me, what it shows is that there's actually a lot more research and practice and experimentation that is needed in this field. And some people are already looking into this, exploring how AI could be integrated into citizens' assembly throughout the entire life cycle, for instance, but also looking at to what extent AI integration into citizens' assembly is actually desirable. And for me, this raises some really fascinating questions relating to the design of the internal governance of a future global assembly. And one practical example is, for instance, the use of automated artificial intelligence translation for transnational deliberation. And these could have an impact for the role that community hosts, for instance, could play in the future. We know, for instance, that in 2021, community hosts played multiple roles. They did the on-street recruitment for the pool of citizens, for the sortition selection. They provided technical support for the assembly members through laptops, internet connection. They also administered various tasks such as the evaluation form, the payment of the assembly members, but they also provided translation throughout the process, and both of written materials and the live discussions. And I think, in my personal experience of observing some of these translations, I don't think the translation was consistent and of quality, and it was depending very much on the levels of English fluency, for instance. So AI in this instance could bring radical change to the role community hosts play in the future. And this is just an illustration of a very specific application of AI to the deliberative process, but there are many more. And I think we need to learn fast around this, and we need to learn in real time as well. So formative evaluation for me will be critical. And finally, and that's the third point for me that I'd like to mention very briefly, but what has come up is, how do you deal with integrity questions, ethics in all these processes, and I'm sure Lucy will talk about that in a moment, but integrity and ethics have to be at the heart of any future global deliberative process. And for me, that's something that I've observed, for instance, in the French Assembly, where there were three external kind of ombudsmen, you could say. They were observers and independent observers. And I think we need to maybe go even beyond that and have ethics board embedded from the outset in any governance going forward. And that's something that's mentioned in the paper. I think it's absolutely critical. So thank you for the work, and thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Clara. It's definitely a really interesting reflection that we shouldn't be opening up one black box and adding in more black boxes with AI and automation. With that point, Lucy Parry will tell us more about integrity. So Lucy, so far we've heard about really critical points, how governance affects legitimacy, how it can break stalemate, how it could also make or break trust, conflict resolution, as well as navigating power hierarchies. What are the implications of these governance questions from a deliberative integrity perspective?
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to speak. So what I wanted to do is share some findings from a paper I'm working on at the moment from our research, which analyses 25 interviews with practitioners of deliberative mini-publics in Europe, Australasia, North and South America. And whilst the interviewees' work was not limited to one kind of commissioning context, in the context of the interviews and the discussions that we had and the ethical issues that came up, they did relate mainly to what I've been calling like the mainstream context of a public authority commissioning a mini-public. So I'm going to share a little bit from that. And what I was really trying to do with this paper is kind of surface the experiences of practitioners on the ground, like what kind of ethical issues do they encounter in their day-to-day work and how do people respond to it. So I wanted to share two ethical pressure points and two responses, two ways in which practitioners try to respond to these and consider how relevant they are to the global assembly and transnational assemblies more broadly. So the first ethical pressure point is the pressure to steer the process. So we heard about some cases where various actors have tried to influence the direction of a mini-public. So several points where this will happen, like the selection of experts and information was one of the most common ones, and also trying to steer or influence the final outcome or the final report contents, things like this. So for the most part, this pressure came from commissioning bodies, but people also told us about pressure coming from other stakeholders, for example, other people with vested interests, and rare cases of participants trying to kind of undermine the process from within as well, but those are more the exception. So I think, as has already been discussed, one of the most interesting differences here is the sort of organising context. So there's no commissioner-practitioner relationship in the same sense here. And this eliminates one of the apparent ethical risks that we see in the existing literature, which is that a practitioner is engaged in like a commercial relationship with a commissioner, and under pressure, they might, try to appease their client over the ideals of the process. Now, I don't think that necessarily happens, and I talk about more about this in the paper, that practitioners can stand up to this type of pressure. But anyway, that relationship isn't there. But that's not to say that transnational assemblies won't come under pressure from various stakeholders involved, like other delivery partners, other external stakeholders, and so on. So that's something to think about there. The second pressure point I want to talk about is the pressure for impact and transformation. So this one is interesting because the pressure that practitioners or our interviewees felt to achieve impact is not only like pressure from other actors to, produce something and meet those expectations. It's also kind of like a pressure from within. It's a pressure that they feel from themselves, and it comes from their normative commitments and ideals and hopes and expectations of deliberative processes, right? That they will achieve something, that they can do something transformative. Right, so impact is framed as an ethical issue and informed by those strong commitments. And in the commissioned context, some practitioners felt frustrated. Everybody feels frustrated about the lack of follow-up, for example, and KNOCA has already done great work on this. But a few people also felt frustrated about what a mini-public can achieve in the commission context. So they felt like the process itself, the method, has this transformative potential. And when I say transformative, we're talking about, the potential to challenge dominant systems of power, dominant economic paradigms, and so on. And they felt like this potential was constrained in a context where the process is commissioned. Practitioners' agency on challenging that is also limited. So you've got like constrained timelines, constrained remits, constrained agendas, and so on and so forth. So again, because of the organising context of the global assembly, that relationship wasn't there. So it didn't have the same type of constraints. So from reading the paper and from what Hazel was sharing, I see the governance structure and the agile approach that Claire talked about as well. Those are innovations in themselves, right? So they have, what I want to know is what transformative potential did they enable, right? So does having this more innovative, decentralized governance structure and approach, what effect does that have on the deliberations themselves and the kind of conversations that were possible? That's something that I think would be interesting to think about. So now I'll move on to how people respond. I didn't time myself, so I'll stop soon, don't worry. So how do practitioners respond to these challenges? So you'll be happy to hear they do a lot of the things that you already recommend in the paper, which is great. And it's important to remember that a lot of the people we spoke to have basically learned from things going wrong, and they had a lot of experience. And similar to something Jayne mentioned, is that a lot of the time these responses weren't part of like formalized procedures or weren't like systematized within practitioner organizations. They're like developed over time and sometimes like in an ad hoc way, right? Sometimes they're formalized as well. So one thing people do is look for red flags when they're considering taking on a project. When you're right at the outset, does it look like participation wash? Does it seem like the commissioner is genuinely interested? What's the upfront commitment? And also, what is the potential for impact? And what potential is there for this to be something more than a one-off event, a one-off deliberative process? These are the type of things that practitioners were looking for when they evaluate, am I going to take on this work or not? So again, even if the Global Assembly didn't have that commissioner element to pay attention to, I think one interesting thing that GloCAN could do is think about, in the cases that already exist for transnational deliberation, what criteria were present or not in the initial organising context, and what effects did those have for the ethics and governance later on? What are the implications of the kind of initial set of circumstances in the initiation and the organisation of the deliberation? And the second thing, which you've given a lot of thought to in the paper, and I thought it was done in a really thoughtful way, which I love, is having things like basically providing clarity, transparency upfront at the outset. So all parties, everybody involved in that process knows what their roles and their responsibilities are, and also knows what like the boundaries around what is acceptable or not. And I liked in particular that Hazel emphasised that this is something that the stakeholders should decide together, right, rather than it being imposed from any one of those parties. So I'll finish there. My final reflection is, I thought it's interesting that even though you've got very different organising contexts and very different sort of typical governance structures here, it seems like some of the possible responses and solutions are quite similar. So I think there's the opportunity for some learning there across these different contexts. So I think that transnational assemblies can learn from mainstream mini publics how they navigate those ethical issues. And I think that mainstream mini publics can learn a lot from how the Global Assembly tried to democratize and decentralize the governance structure as well. So I'd love to see especially some more kind of comparative research on these ethics and governance issues across these different organizing contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And that point on the connection between the innovations and governance structures and deliberation itself is a really important point. Hopefully, we could collaborate on this research in the near future. In closing the roundtable discussion, I'd like to invite Hazel for final remarks, and then we'll stop recording, we'll open time for questions and answers from the participants.
Yeah, thanks, Nardine, and thank you everyone for your inputs. It's very interesting to listen to your works and to your reflections, because coming up with a paper like this, it was not so easy, right, Belle, Lucas? And listening to your inputs, one thing is clear, that this kinds of conversation is very important, because across the world, the challenge here is that common among transnational assemblies is the fact that it operates on an informal manner, and that coming up with a structure to formalize everything, processes, and address challenges such as hierarchy of power and even issues of ethics, which reflects our values as individuals, and then how it reflects in our work involving a lot of people, especially assembly members, is very challenging. And it's worth looking into that, and we are taking down notes on those points that Jayne, Lucy, and even Claire has raised. So thank you so much.